Okay, so we're going to look at some parts of Chapter 39, Community Ecology, and this will be our last chapter for this course. And so it's nice to end at the very top of the hierarchy of biology, because in Biology 1406, we start with the atom, the molecule, the macromolecule, organelles, and cells. And then in 1407, we talk a little bit about tissues, organs, and organ systems. We talk quite a bit about populations and species and evolutionary biology in that area. And then now we're moving up to communities and ecosystems. And so it's kind of a nice ending for this course. Okay. So in this lecture, I want to define what a community is and what an ecosystem is, in case you forgot. And we're also going to look at succession, biological succession or ecological succession, and then geochemical cycles. And then in the next lecture segment, we'll cover energy flow in what are called trophic levels. Okay, so just to define communities, a community includes all the different species that are in a geographic area. So it can be, all kinds of plant species, all kinds of fungus, all kinds of protists, microorganisms, animals, of course, everything collectively that's contained within some kind of prescribed geographic area. And so the number of species, the number of different species present is called the species richness of the community. And then we're going to talk more towards the end of this lecture series on what productivity is. And that has to do with how much energy. It says produced. I hate that word. Energy is not produced. It's just transferred or transformed from the sun into different forms. But how much of that energy is captured and then transferred and transformed into biomass. So biological chemicals, organic compounds. And then there are interactions that govern the ecological and evolutionary processes of any community, which a lot of it has to do with predation, and then various interactions between organisms, symbiotic and mutual relationships. However, we won't talk much about those things in this chapter lecture. Okay, now before I get to this slide, let's talk about what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a community plus all of the non-living components as well. So community is really referring just to the living or biotic or part of it. And then ecosystem includes the abiotic or non-living components. So you may remember when you did your scavenger hunt, you had to find some you had to try to take photos of abiotic components, and a lot of you took a picture of the sun or the air, which is hard to take a picture of, the soil or rocks or water. So these are all abiotic parts of an ecosystem. Okay, so the first big topic here then is succession, all right? We've learned about different organisms. We've learned about fungus. We've learned about protists. We've learned about plants and animals. We haven't focused a lot on bacteria, but you'll get that when you take microbiology, but that certainly could be included here. And the term succession really refers to a change in the ecosystem. And the change is really dictated by the organisms that are able to survive and reproduce based on what resources are available in that ecosystem. And so communities have a tendency to change from very simple to more complex in a process called succession. And as the process keeps going, the organisms that are there are changing the environment, and so then more organisms and more diversity is able to come to that location or to that geographic area. So let's imagine from from a bare bones point of view, let's say you have an island that has just risen up out of the ocean because of because of an underwater volcano, and the lava has come up out of the water, and you would have just like rock, just volcanic rock that's poking out of the ocean. Then that would be the beginning of a new island. And so in this example, you would start with bare, lifeless substrate, just meaning the surface has no life. And if you've ever looked at volcanic rock, it's very porous. It has little holes in it. And the beauty of that is when it rains, or when water is there, it gathers in these little holes, and it creates a very tough, but an environment where some organisms can grow. And so, usually when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about a surface that's just rock or sand or something that's not, it doesn't have any organic material necessarily. And typically what happens then is you will get spores. They can be carried on animals or just in the ocean water, or spores from different organisms can get to that volcanic rock. And spores, fungus makes spores, and we've talked about some of the plants that make spores. And so you probably have some algae there if it's ocean water. And so typically the first or second organisms that are going to start to grow on that rock are going to be lichens. Lichens are probably the first. Lichens, you'll remember, that's a combination of a photosynthetic organism living with a symbiotic relationship with a fungus. So the fungus is absorbing the minerals from the rock, and the photosynthetic organism is converting CO2 and sunlight into some organic compounds, sugars at first. And you start to have the growth of some living organisms, and they reproduce and they grow and they start covering that rock surface. And when they die, their dead bodies become the first layer of organic matter on top of that rock. And the lichen can also break down the rock and make those minerals more available. And so typically next you'll have moss. Moss also do not need soil. They can grow directly on rock. And but there could be a little bit of soil there. But moss spores will start growing. You'll remember the gametophytes grow from the spores. And they'll start growing and reproducing. And moss are, maybe a little taller than lichens or maybe about the same. But they'll start living and dying and reproducing and spreading, and that's adding more layer of soil, the dead bodies. So now we have more organic material there, and then you'll start getting bigger and bigger plants, for example. So shrubs, there could be a lot of options for the third, but I put shrubs. And then trees. And you remember that for the plants that have roots, because moss don't have roots, but for shrubs and trees, those roots are going to start pushing down into the soil. And remember, they have mycorrhizae, which are those fungus that are associated with those roots. And so they help to fix nitrogen. We'll talk about the nitrogen cycle in a little bit. And so there's nitrogen there, we have carbon fixation, which is photosynthesis, and then the plants are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is a pretty typical way of thinking about a succession starting from a volcanic island, which is truly starting from really nothingness, to where you have you could have a very lush tropical island by the end of this. Now, what is the time scale on this? It can be quite a long time for this to all happen. So I'm not saying it happens in a couple of weeks. We're talking about a longer period of time. But this is a nice kind of a real case where there was in Glacier Bay, we have a primary succession. Here you're starting with rocks and just there was a glacier that moved away, and the rocks, and it's just a very bare, kind of barren soil. But over time, some lower, small plant material and plants growing, and then shrubs over here on letter C, and then full trees on letter D. So now you've gone from moss in year one to different kinds of shrubs, alder shrubs, and then the spruce trees. And you can also see when they measure the soil how it's gone from very low levels of nitrogen to much, much higher levels. So that's a succession. All right, and this one, 200 years. All right. Now, you don't always have to start from nothingness. It doesn't always have to start from just bare rock. So we can use the term secondary succession to refer to kind of the same process, but starting from an area that's not just bare rock. There's some examples here. A forest after a fire, that's not just bare rock. There's definitely some soil and some materials, some organic materials there. Or a field that's not been cultivated, so there is already some organic material there, but you're going to still have a similar succession from whatever the starting point is. So you can have growth of moss or growth of small shrubs, and then moving towards bigger and bigger plants and more species. And we haven't even brought in the discussion of the animals, certainly. So succession happens because as the species are able to grow and utilize the habitat, they leave behind or they add to the resources in that habitat, and that favors more species being able to come into that habitat or to that geographical area. So species diversity will usually increase in the early stages of succession. However, it's not unusual for there to be a decline in some of the later stages because sometimes you get sort of a big predator or a big competitor that sort of takes over. It's hard, each case is certainly has its own details, but this is a very typical process. All right. So we say succession starts with establishment. Early successional species are characterized by, and now I'm bringing in some of your vocabulary words, are selected species that are tolerant of harsher conditions. So like the lichens and the moss, they don't need much to be able to grow and reproduce. So that's considered a harsh condition. An R-selected species is, R stands for reproductive capacity. And what that means is they can reproduce in massive amounts very quickly. Usually they're not, what can I say? I think that's what I want to say. They reproduce in large numbers very quickly. And they R-selected species tend to do better when the environment is kind of, I would say, unstable or harsh is a good way of saying it. And so even though you have lots of offspring, they won't all survive, but and we say strategy, but of course we know that organisms don't, plan their evolution, but the way that they reproduce is beneficial for survival of the species, not survival of the individual in those really harsh conditions or changing conditions. All right. But once the habitat sort of starts to get more nutrients and more stability, then what you tend to have is K-selected species will start to replace the R-selected species, in the sense that K species, and we always use a capital K, that stands for carrying capacity, which I know does not start with a K. But K means, so in K-selected species, the organisms don't reproduce as many offspring, but the offspring are better fit as long as the environment is pretty stable. All right. So in animals, our selected species would be like an insect that can have thousands and thousands of offspring, and most of them won't even survive, but that's, some of them will. But a K-selected species like humans are K-selected species. We only have, one or two offspring at a time, but there's a lot of care, and we're pretty sure that those offspring are going to survive because the environment is pretty stable. So more care is put into each, and more energy is put into making less numbers of offspring, but better adapted to survival in that more stable environment. All right. And you can have inhibition, which is sometimes the changes in the habitat caused by one species can inhibit the growth of the original species. So when we say dynamic, what we mean is they can switch back and forth to different ones. But typically in the early succession stages, you have these very high reproducing species, and then you get typically a sort of a turnover or a changeover to these K-selected species. All right. So a good example of this is in the Krakatoa Island. In 1883, there was a volcanic eruption. And I like this title here. It says, Fauna Changes in Synchrony with Vegetation. Okay, what that means, fauna are animals. That's the animals. Fauna are animals. Flora is typically, in an ecosystem, flora would be the plants. Vegetation also refers to plants. So fauna changes in synchrony with the vegetation. That's just saying the animals will change in a way along with how the vegetation changes. So whatever food is available in the plants, that's going to kind of dictate what our animal groups will be in any kind of situation for sure. But in 1883, there was a volcanic eruption, and 9 months after the eruption, there was pretty much nothing left. A little grass and one spider. So by 1908, there were grasslands covering, all of that soil. All of that volcanic rock. And then by the 1930s, it was now forested. The grassland animals had disappeared, and then some other animals appeared. All right. And so as the vegetation is changing, the animals will kind of parallel that because the animals depend on the plants for food, not the other way around. All right. Okay, so let's talk about biogeochemical cycles. And we are not going to go super deep into this, but I've given you a couple of definitions that you're going to be asked to learn. All right. So a biogeochemical cycle refers to the cycling of a particular element through an ecosystem. And there's always going to be biotic and abiotic processes. So we're talking about biology and geology, and certainly chemistry across the board. But you're talking about, this is where biology and geology start to combine. So biogeochemical cycles occur over spatial spatial scales and time scales, and they cross the boundaries of an ecosystem. So the cycle doesn't know where the limits of the ecosystem are, so that's just a human creation. Okay, so the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is fundamentally just living organisms use photosynthesis for carbon fixation. So carbon fixation, you'll remember, is the first stage of the Calvin cycle. It's defined as any metabolic reactions that make organic compounds from carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is considered inorganic carbon. And so you may recall Rubisco is the enzyme that can connect or integrate or fix carbon into an existing organic carbon compound called ribulose bisphosphate, or RuBP. Anyway, so the CO2 is fixed by connecting it into an organic molecule. That's what fixation means. All right, so carbon fixation puts inorganic CO2 into organic compounds. Cellular respiration and some decomposition reactions will release CO2 back into the environment. So you have this, opposites in terms of biological processes. You have these opposite processes. And in in water, CO2 is dissolved in water and it can become bicarbonate, just very much like it becomes bicarbonate in your blood. Through CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid, which can dissociate into bicarbonate. So this is a very complicated diagram, which we are not going to learn all of it. But what we're saying is there's a balanced process that moves CO2 from the atmosphere into the organisms, into the soil, into the water, and this is all in balance. Okay, you can see photosynthesis here, you can see respiration here, you have some geological processes here. So this is all supposed to be in balance, but here's where I'm going with this. If the carbon cycle proceeds faster in any one of those directions, it puts everything out of balance. And just like if you think of the body or the cell, an ecosystem is an entity similar to one organism or one cell. When we're looking at the ecosystem, it's an entity. And if something in the entity is out of balance, you're going to have problems. So there are consequences if the parts of the carbon cycle are going faster than other parts in sort of an unnatural way, human-caused way. So, for example, the fossil fuels that are in the earth built up over millions of years, but we're burning them and within, just a few hundred years, and that's creating a large imbalance of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the effects of that, global warming, the greenhouse effect, and because the CO2 dissolves in the water to make carbonic acid, it's lowering the pH of the oceans. And that's causing a lot of bleaching of corals and all kinds of effects from that. Okay, the water cycle. The water cycle is, fundamentally evaporation of liquid water into the atmosphere and then rain back down back to land into bodies of water. Now, 90% of the evaporation in a terrestrial ecosystem happens from the leaves of plants, all right? But water in the atmosphere is a gas. Water vapor cools and falls to the surface as precipitation. So again, a super complex diagram, but not one that you're going to have to draw or memorize. But the sense is that everything's in balance, right? You have over millions of years, things are balanced. And when they do change, they change slowly, at least when humans are not causing the change. And so there's water moving from the gas form back to land, into the organisms, into groundwater, all of these things. All right. But what disrupts this? All right. Humans are depleting the aquifers. Aquifers are one of our main sources for drinking water. We're depleting them faster than they're being recharged by natural rain. Deforestation disrupts the water cycle, and this radically changes the ecosystem. A lot of places that there used to be rainforests, they completely leveled the rainforest to make, I think they were trying to make farmland, but a lot of it has now just become a desert because you completely disrupted or upended the whole system. So this kind of human belief that we can just mess with something and there's no consequences, I think we can all see that that's just not the case. But I guess humans hope that there's not going to be any consequences. All right, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a component of all your proteins and in your nitrogenous bases of your nucleic acids, especially. But nitrogen is pretty hard for organisms to come by. Most nitrogen is in the air. Atmospheric or gaseous nitrogen is N2. But there has to be ways to convert that into forms that organisms can use. Organisms can use nitrate and they can use ammonia. And there are organisms, microorganisms, fungus, and bacteria that can convert N2 gas into these other compounds. All right, so that's nitrogen fixation, the synthesis of nitrogen-containing compounds that are usable by organisms. So taking N2 from the atmosphere and converting them into some of these other forms is nitrogen fixation. And we depend on microbes to do this. But then here come the humans, fertilizer. Massive amounts of nitrogen are converted into fertilizer. So you're talking about nitrates mainly. And by artificially making fertilizer, it is disrupting the whole cycle. It's basically short circuiting. I was thinking about this, and it's like if the ecosystem is an entity, it's an organism, then there's sort of a short circuit happening because of human involvement. And one thing about fertilizer is it puts too much nitrogen into the soil, but it can run off with rainwater. It can be washed off into bodies of water, and then you get these massive growth of things you don't want in the bodies of water. Massive algae blooms, and remember, these bodies are what we use for drinking water. So when there's a taste of bleach, sometimes I can taste bleach in the tap water, just a little bit. It's because of all the algae. They're using bleach to try to get in probably some microbes other than algae, but they're trying to kill that off, and I can taste it in the tap water sometimes. So all of these things are like human activity creating this sort of short circuit in the entity, in the body of the ecosystem, and there's going to be different levels of failure, you could say, because of that. So fertilizer really messes with the nitrogen cycle. Humans deforestation and tapping into water supplies is messing with the water cycle, and the usage of fossil fuels, burning all the fossil fuels, is really messing with the carbon cycle. Now, I'm not saying those are the only things, but we're going to kind of put the main problem that humans are causing for each of these cycles. That's what I want you to connect with this. The last cycle is called the phosphorus cycle. And the phosphorus cycle, remember, phosphorus is part of phosphate groups, so nucleic acids. Your phospholipids have phosphorus in phosphate ATP. There is no phosphorus in any kind of in the air. There's no gaseous phosphorus. So, but there is inorganic phosphate. But fertilizers, again, and detergents mess with the phosphorus cycle. So our usage of fertilizer and then also detergents disrupts the natural phosphorus cycle. Okay, so what I would do when you're making notes for these geochemical cycles, put the name of the cycle. There's 4 of them: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and water cycle. And then just put some notes about what each one is when it's working properly, I guess you could say, and then what it is about human activity that disrupts it or short circuits it. And then when you're writing about succession, just have an idea, a rough idea about the succession. The primary succession is a really good example of it, how that tends to go, starting from, let's say, a brand new volcanic island. So I'm going to end the lecture here, and I'm going to, the next part of this lecture will be covering the flow of energy in ecosystems. That'll be a different segment.